Ingrid Bergman and Anna Magnani, two women trapped in Rossellini's destructive love triangle. This is the story of the saint's exile and the muse's revenge. A woman standing entirely alone, formally denounced on the floor of the United States Senate as an apostle of degradation. Stripped of her right to motherhood and permanently exiled from her adopted homeland, she is despised by the very public who, just a few short years earlier, worshipped her as Hollywood's flawless monument to purity. This fallen saint was Ingrid Bergman. Yet her catastrophic fall did not happen in a vacuum. It was ignited across the Atlantic by the brutal betrayal of another cinematic titan, Anna Magnani. Magnani was the fierce, undisputed queen of Italian cinema, a devoted muse ruthlessly discarded by the visionary director Roberto Rossellini the moment Bergman's fateful fan letter arrived. How did two of the greatest women in cinematic history find themselves trapped in a bitter, destructive love triangle, where one was forced to wage a fiery war of vengeance, and the other was crushed by the very system that created her? Her sheer destruction was magnified by the impossible pedestal upon which she was placed. When the legendary producer David O. Selznick brought Ingrid Bergman from Sweden to Hollywood in the late 1930s, he looked at her and saw something entirely alien to the American studio system. Hollywood was a factory of manufactured glamour. It was the era of the plucked eyebrow, the painted lip, the platinum blonde femme fatale. Selznick ordered that Bergman remain untouched. No makeup, no plucked eyebrows, no name change. He did not just market an actress, he marketed an illusion of incorruptible natural innocence. She became the virgin saint of cinema. In Casablanca, her tear-filled eyes conveyed a noble, tragic loyalty. In The Bells of St. Mary's, she played a nun so radiant that audiences genuinely believed she possessed divine grace. In Joan of Arc, she literally played a martyr burning at the stake for her pure beliefs. The American public did not just love Ingrid Bergman, they felt a moral ownership over her. She was the ideal wife, the perfect mother, the untouched European beauty. But behind the luminous smile, Bergman was suffocating. Her real life was governed by her husband, Peter Lindstrom, a strict, uncompromising man who managed her career, her finances, and her public image with the cold precision of a surgeon. He measured her caloric intake. He dictated her contracts. She was the most famous woman on earth, yet she possessed no agency. She was a bird trapped in a meticulously gilded cage, yearning for a storm to break the bars. That storm was gathering across the Atlantic, amid the post-war rubble of Italy. If Ingrid Bergman was the untouchable saint of the heavens, Anna Magnani was the bleeding heart of the earth. Magnani reigned as the fierce, undisputed queen of Italian cinema. She was a woman of fire, wild, fiercely intelligent, and intensely passionate. With her dark, untamed hair and eyes shadowed by the trauma of war, she represented the raw, unfiltered reality of human survival. In the landmark 1945 film, Rome, Open City, Magnani's agonizing run through the streets behind a Gestapo truck became the defining image of a broken but defiant Europe. The man who directed that film, the man Magnani loved, funded, and fiercely championed, was the visionary Roberto Rossellini. Rossellini was undeniably a genius, a founding father of Italian neorealism. He stripped away the artificial glamour of cinema, taking cameras into the devastated streets to capture the truth. But behind the camera, historians and contemporaries paint a portrait of a calculated emotional predator. Born into privilege, Rossellini was an aristocrat of the arts. He was a man who used human affection as cheap fuel for his own creative fire, viewing the women in his life not as equal partners, but as raw material to be consumed. The collision of these three lives began in the dark of an American cinema. One evening, feeling deeply stifled by her pristine Hollywood image and her coldly controlling husband, Ingrid Bergman sat in a small theater and watched Rome, Open City. She was mesmerized. It was rough, it was real, it was everything Hollywood was not. She followed it by watching his next film, Paisan. Moved to her core, and perhaps subconsciously seeking a savior to rescue her from her own perfect life, she wrote a fateful note to the director. Her letter was brief, professional, yet carried a fatal vulnerability. She praised his work, offered her services as an actress, and famously concluded that in Italian, she only knew the words "ti amo," I love you. For Rossellini, reading that letter in Rome, this was not merely a casting opportunity. It was a conquest. To direct the untouchable Ingrid Bergman was a shortcut to global dominance, a way to secure massive American funding, and a triumph for his colossal ego. The betrayal of his current muse was swift, clinical, and absolute. Rossellini and Anna Magnani were living together in Rome's luxurious Hotel Excelsior. They shared a bed, a life, and a creative vision. He had promised her the lead in his next great masterpiece, Stromboli, a raw depiction of a desperate refugee stranded on a harsh, unforgiving volcanic island. Magnani, who had fiercely supported Rossellini when he was struggling to find funding, believed the role was her rightful reward. The script was tailored to her volatile energy. Rossellini ruthlessly took Stromboli from Magnani's hands and handed it to the American saint. He dropped Magnani with chilling speed. The dismissal was not just a breakup. It was a public execution of a muse's dignity. When Magnani discovered the betrayal, the confrontation was visceral and violent. Historical accounts suggest a furious argument in their hotel room, famously culminating in Magnani hurling a plate of pasta onto Rossellini's head before storming out into the Roman night, her pride shattered, but her spirit entirely unbroken. Rossellini simply wiped the sauce from his face and moved on. He was entirely indifferent to the devastation left in his wake, his eyes fixed firmly on the glamorous prize arriving from Hollywood. When Ingrid Bergman stepped off the plane in Italy, she believed she was walking into a grand artistic liberation. She believed she had found a man who saw her not as a saint, but as a real, breathing woman. She left her husband. She left her daughter Pia, believing she would soon send for her. She surrendered herself entirely to Rossellini and to the island of Stromboli. But Ingrid's triumph over Magnani was an illusion. It was the seed of a brutal tragedy. By following a blind romantic impulse, she triggered the wrath of the American moral machinery. The press descended. The scandal of a married Hollywood icon having an affair with a foreign director and soon becoming pregnant out of wedlock shattered the illusion David O. Selznick had so carefully built. The public felt betrayed. The saint had fallen from the altar, and the punishment for a fallen woman in 1950 was complete and total erasure. Two of the greatest women in the world were suddenly thrown into what the international press gleefully dubbed the Volcano War. Because Anna Magnani, the Roman she-wolf, refused to quietly disappear into the shadows. She would not be discarded and forgotten. She chose a path of bitter, grueling retaliation. If Rossellini wanted to make a film about a woman on a volcano with his new American star, Magnani would do the exact same thing, but she would do it first, and she would do it better. She immediately accepted the lead role in a rival film, aptly titled Volcano. The setting was no coincidence. The production set up camp on a volcanic island in the Mediterranean, separated only by a narrow stretch of sea from where Rossellini and Bergman were filming Stromboli. The stage was set. Under the blistering Mediterranean sun, surrounded by coarse black ash, suffocating sulfur, and hostile winds, the two film crews dug in for a silent, bitter war. It was a brutal environment that offered no comfort and no escape. The Tyrrhenian Sea, off the northern coast of Sicily, is a place of ancient mythological beauty, but it offers no sanctuary. Rising violently from the deep blue waters are the Aeolian Islands. They are not gentle paradises. They are jagged teeth of black rock, born of subterranean fire, scarred by centuries of eruptions, and steeped in a silence that feels almost hostile to human life. It was here, in the spring of 1949, that the grandest, most bitter spectacle in the history of cinema was staged. The international press, salivating at the scandal, had already christened it the Volcano War. On one side of the water, on the smoking island of Stromboli, was the runaway Hollywood saint, Ingrid Bergman, and her new master, Roberto Rossellini. Just 14 miles across the very same stretch of water, on the equally treacherous island of Volcano, stood the discarded queen, Anna Magnani. If one were to write this as a work of fiction, critics would dismiss it as entirely too melodramatic. Yet history requires no exaggeration. The battle lines were drawn in volcanic ash. The psychological torture of this dual production was driven by the very weapon Rossellini wielded, his camera. Rossellini was the pioneer of Italian neorealism. In the universities and the salons of Paris, this was hailed as a cinematic revolution. It meant abandoning the artificial sound stages, the heavy makeup, and the contrived lighting of the studio system. It meant capturing the raw, unvarnished truth of the human condition. But behind the lens, Rossellini's method was far more sinister. He did not merely observe reality, he engineered trauma to capture a genuine reaction. He was a director who thrived on absolute control through absolute chaos. He abhorred traditional scripts. He despised actors who relied on technique. He preferred to use local villagers, fishermen and peasants, individuals who did not know how to act but only knew how to exist. And into this chaotic, primitive arena, he dragged the most polished, protected actress on the face of the earth. When Ingrid Bergman stepped off the boat onto the black sands of Stromboli, the culture shock was immediate and devastating. She had spent the last decade in Hollywood, a place where her every need was anticipated. If the lighting was unflattering, a cinematographer spent 3 hours fixing it. If she was thirsty, an assistant appeared with a silver tray. If the script was weak, armies of writers were summoned in the middle of the night to rewrite her dialogue. Stromboli offered none of this. There were no hotels, there was no running water, there was no electricity, no paved roads, and certainly no glamorous wardrobe. The island was a barren rock inhabited by a few hundred impoverished fishermen and their families, living in modest, crumbling homes painted in faded pastels. The stench of sulfur hung heavy in the air, catching in the back of the throat. Rossellini intentionally isolated her. He rented a small pink stucco house for them to share, but the living conditions were agonizingly primitive. And worse, there was no script. Bergman, a woman who possessed a photographic memory and who found comfort in the rigid discipline of learning her lines weeks in advance, was suddenly adrift. Each morning she would ask Rossellini what they were filming that day. He would simply shrug, look at the sky, and say they would figure it out when the camera rolled. This was not a chaotic accident. It was a calculated psychological tactic. The film Stromboli was about a refined, desperate Baltic refugee who marries a simple Italian fisherman to escape an internment camp, only to find herself trapped on a desolate, terrifying island where the locals view her with deep suspicion. Rossellini did not want Bergman to act the part of an alienated, terrified, and exhausted woman. He wanted her to be one. He manipulated her environment so that her real-life isolation mirrored her character's despair. When she cried out in frustration on set, begging for direction, begging for a line of dialogue, Rossellini would calmly order the cameraman to keep rolling. He captured her genuine tears, her genuine exhaustion, her genuine feeling of being utterly trapped. He was mining her soul, extracting her distress and exposing it to the light. Bergman, blinded by her infatuation and her desperate desire to break free from her Hollywood cage, submitted to this emotional vivisection. She mistook his cruelty for artistic genius. She mistook his control for protection. Meanwhile, just across the water, the air was thick with a very different kind of tension. Anna Magnani did not arrive on the island of Volcano as a victim. She arrived as a general preparing for a siege. The island of Volcano was, if anything, even more inhospitable than Stromboli. The ground was literally hot to the touch. Fumaroles hissed, spitting toxic yellow sulfuric gases into the air. It was a landscape that looked like the very gates of hell. And here, Magnani set up her court. She had secured the backing of a rival production company. Ironically, she had hired a Hollywood director, William Dieterle, to helm the project. But make no mistake, Volcano was Anna Magnani's film. She dictated the terms. She controlled the pacing. She was entirely consumed by a singular burning objective. She must finish her film before Rossellini finished his, and her performance had to be undeniably, overwhelmingly superior. Her pride had been shattered in Rome, but out here, on the scorched earth of the Mediterranean, she was forging it anew into a weapon. Magnani's character in Volcano was a former prostitute exiled back to her bleak island home, fighting to protect her younger sister from a predatory man. The parallels to her own life were impossible to ignore. Every scene of defiance, every scream of rage, every look of weary, bone-deep sorrow was infused with the venom of her real-world betrayal. The physical demands placed upon her were staggering. In one sequence, Magnani was required to dive into the treacherous, unpredictable waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. She refused to use a stunt double. She threw herself into the jagged waves, her dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying intensity. She was not just battling the ocean, she was battling the ghost of the man 14 miles away. She knew Rossellini was over there. She could look across the water on a clear day and see the silhouette of the island where the man she loved was parading his new, shiny Hollywood prize. The proximity was a unique kind of torture. It fueled a relentless, exhausting energy on the set of Volcano. Magnani barely slept. She smoked incessantly. She drove her crew to the brink of collapse, pushing them to work faster, harder, longer, and they were not alone. The remote Aeolian Islands, for centuries forgotten by the modern world, suddenly became the epicenter of the global media. The press descended like a swarm of locusts. Paparazzi, desperate for a photograph of the disgraced Hollywood saint or the vengeful Italian queen, rented fishing boats at exorbitant prices. They bobbed in the rough waters just offshore, armed with massive, heavy telephoto lenses, waiting for a moment of weakness. Journalists bribed locals for gossip. They fabricated stories when the truth was too slow to emerge. The newspapers back in America and Europe ran daily updates, treating the film shoots like a heavyweight boxing match. Who would wrap production first? Is the Hollywood saint cracking under the pressure? Is the Italian wolf planning to sail across the strait and confront her rival? The scrutiny was suffocating. For Ingrid Bergman, the reality of her situation began to sink in with the weight of a stone. The romantic letter she had exchanged with Rossellini in the safety of her Hollywood dressing room felt like a naive fantasy compared to the brutal reality of Stromboli. The sun was merciless. Her skin, once so carefully protected by studio umbrellas, burned and peeled. Her feet were cut by the sharp volcanic rocks. And then, the final crushing blow. She realized she was pregnant. In 1949, for a married woman, the paragon of American cinematic virtue, to carry the child of her foreign lover was not just a scandal. It was social suicide. The secret was impossible to keep on an island swarming with reporters. When the news inevitably leaked, the backlash was of a magnitude rarely seen in modern history. The letters from America changed from disappointed fan mail to vitriolic hate mail. She was called a whore, a communist, a traitor to her gender. Her husband, Petter Lindstrom, initiated a brutal, highly publicized divorce proceeding, tightening his legal grip on their daughter, Pia. Bergman was trapped. She could not go back to America. She would be crucified. She could only press forward into the dark, clinging to Rossellini, the very man who had dragged her into the fire. Rossellini, for his part, seemed to relish the infamy. The scandal was free publicity. He grew increasingly possessive, isolating Bergman further from her few remaining allies. He intercepted her mail. He spoke for her in interviews. He began to weave the bars of the cage that would hold her for the next 7 years. As the summer wore on, the tension on both islands reached a breaking point. And then, as if the gods themselves had grown tired of the human melodrama, nature intervened. The volcano on Stromboli, which had been smoking quietly for months, suddenly erupted. It was a violent, terrifying display of power. Molten lava spewed into the night sky, raining fire and ash down upon the fragile village. The earth shook. The roar of the mountain deafened the crew. Villagers screamed, gathering their meager belongings to flee to the boats. Rossellini, ever the predator of reality, did not order his crew to evacuate. He ordered them to roll the cameras. Amidst the genuine terror, the choking smoke, and the falling ash, he pushed Ingrid Bergman into the frame. The panic in her eyes was not acting. The desperation with which she scrambled over the sharp rocks was the very real instinct of a woman trying to survive. Rossellini captured the climax of his film not through artifice, but by exploiting a natural disaster. Across the water on Volcano, Magnani watched the sky turn red. She watched the plume of smoke rise from the island where her betrayer stood. She did not flinch. She simply turned back to her own camera, her jaw set, her heart hardened into something resembling the cold, black rock beneath her feet. The filming of both movies eventually concluded. The crews packed their equipment, the paparazzi boarded their boats, and the islands were left once again to the silence of the sea and the wind. When the volcanic ash finally settled over the Mediterranean, the cameras stopped rolling. The crews packed away their heavy equipment, and the fishing boats carried the exhausted cast members back to the mainland. But if Ingrid Bergman and Magnani believed the hardest part of their ordeal was over, they were tragically mistaken. The Volcano War had merely entered its second, far more destructive phase. The battleground shifted from the jagged, sulfur-choked rocks of the Aeolian Islands to the darkened editing rooms of Rome and Los Angeles. It was here that the brutal machinery of the film industry and the unforgiving judgment of society would begin to crush them both. Anna Magnani, driven by a relentless, consuming need for vengeance, forced her production to move at a breakneck speed. She was determined that her film Volcano would reach the public before Rossellini's Stromboli. She drove her director, William Dieterle, to the point of exhaustion. The editing process was frantic. In her desperation to strike the first blow against the man who had discarded her, Magnani sacrificed nuance for speed. Volcano premiered first, securing a minor bitter victory for the Italian she-wolf. But the triumph was hollow. The film was undeniably powerful, carried almost entirely by Magnani's ferocious, feral performance. But the rushed production showed. The critics were divided. Magnani had proved she could survive without Rossellini, but the emotional toll of the vendetta had left her exhausted and deeply wounded. She retreated into the shadows of Rome, nursing a bruised heart, waiting to see how the world would receive the American saint who had stolen her crown. What happened next to Ingrid Bergman, however, was not merely a poor cinematic reception. It was a systematic institutional slaughter. The absolute devastation of Ingrid Bergman's life was systematically engineered by the deeply hypocritical machinery of Hollywood and the puritanical paranoia of post-war America. The American release of Stromboli was entirely out of Roberto Rossellini's hands. The distribution rights had been purchased by the notoriously eccentric and controlling billionaire Howard Hughes, who owned RKO Pictures. Hughes cared nothing for Italian neorealism. He cared nothing for Rossellini's artistic vision of a woman's spiritual awakening on a barren island. Hughes saw only one thing: scandal. And scandal was a commodity that could be sold. Without Rossellini's permission, Hughes took the film into the RKO editing rooms and butchered it. He chopped away the slow existential dread that Rossellini had so painstakingly crafted. Instead, Hughes instructed his marketing department to exploit Bergman's real-life affair. RKO released sensationalized posters featuring a volcano erupting with the tagline, "Raging Island, Raging Passions. This is it." The film, they said, could never be made. It was a cheap, vulgar betrayal of everything Bergman had sacrificed her reputation to create. Rossellini was apoplectic with rage, threatening international lawsuits, but he was powerless against the American studio system. The film released by RKO was a disjointed, confusing mess, but the quality of the film was entirely irrelevant to the American public. They did not buy tickets to see a masterpiece. They bought tickets to witness the fall of a saint. When the news officially broke that Ingrid Bergman, still legally married to Peter Lindstrom, was pregnant with Roberto Rossellini's child, the moral outrage of the United States reached a fever pitch. This was 1950. America was entering the grip of the Red Scare, a time of intense conformity and profound paranoia. Deviance of any kind was viewed not just as a personal failing, but as a threat to the moral fabric of the nation. Ingrid Bergman had broken the unspoken contract she had with the American public. She was supposed to be the virgin, the nun, the martyr, by acting on her own sexual and romantic agency, by choosing a fiery, unpredictable Italian artist over her rigid, respectable Swedish-American husband. She had shattered the illusion. And society does not forgive those who shatter its favorite illusions. The backlash was a terrifying spectacle of collective hatred. Religious groups organized boycotts, standing outside cinemas with picket signs condemning her to hell. Ed Sullivan, the most powerful television host in America, publicly declared He would never allow her on his show. And then came the ultimate condemnation. On the polished marble floor of the United States Senate, Senator Edwin C. Johnson delivered his infamous speech. He did not merely criticize her. He proposed legislation to police the morality of actors, citing Bergman as the catalyst. He called her a free love cultist and demanded she be permanently barred from ever setting foot on American soil again. It is a chilling paradox. Only a few years earlier, Bergman had worn heavy armor and faced the flames as Joan of Arc, portraying a woman burned at the stake by a rigid patriarchal system of power. Now, that exact same system was burning her in real life. She was officially in exile, but the loss of her career in her adopted country was nothing compared to the agony of what awaited her in the courts of law. Her husband, Petter Lindstrom, was a cold, methodical man. His pride had been publicly shredded, and his revenge was absolute. He initiated a bitter, highly publicized divorce. But Lindstrom did not just want to end the marriage, he wanted to obliterate her right to motherhood. Through a grueling legal battle, Lindstrom fought for and won sole custody of their young daughter, Pia. Bergman, trapped in Italy and facing arrest on charges of moral turpitude if she returned to America, was powerless. The court decreed that she was an unfit mother. The psychological torture of this separation cannot be overstated. Bergman was trapped in Rome, heavily pregnant, surrounded by paparazzi who camped outside her apartment building day and night, waiting for the bastard child to be born. Inside, she sat in the oppressive Roman heat, weeping over photographs of Pia. She wrote her daughter desperate, heartbreaking letters, pleading for her to remember her mother, begging for a scrap of connection. Many of those letters were intercepted, read by lawyers, or kept from the child entirely. For years, Pia would grow up believing her mother had simply abandoned her for a glamorous life in Europe. The grief of a mother stripped of her child is a silent, suffocating thing. It hollowed Bergman out. The public mocked her tears, convinced they were the crocodile tears of an actress. They were entirely blind to the visceral, bone-deep agony of a woman whose heart was bleeding across the Atlantic Ocean. And what of the sanctuary she had sacrificed everything to reach? What of the grand, sweeping romance with the brilliant Roberto Rossellini? When the flashbulbs finally dimmed and the doors of their Roman apartment closed, Ingrid Bergman woke up to a stark, terrifying reality. The dream of artistic and personal liberation had curdled into a nightmare of absolute control. Roberto Rossellini was a man of profound contradictions. He was a cinematic revolutionary, yet at home, he was a deeply conservative, patriarchal tyrant. He had rescued Bergman from the rigid management of Lindstrom, only to impose a far more suffocating regime of his own. Rossellini was consumed by a toxic, paralyzing insecurity. He knew he had won the most famous woman in the world, but he lived in constant fear that she would realize she did not need him. To prevent this, he began to systematically dismantle her independence. He demanded absolute ownership over her, both as a wife and as an artist. Rossellini decreed that Ingrid Bergman would never again be directed by another man. She was his muse, his property, his instrument. This was not a romantic gesture of devotion, it was a prison sentence. The greatest directors in Europe, recognizing Bergman's immense untapped talent, came knocking on their door. Federico Fellini, a rising master of Italian cinema, desperately wanted to work with her. Franco Zeffirelli offered her stage roles. Hollywood studios, seeing the financial potential of a comeback, quietly sent scripts offering exorbitant sums of money. Rossellini rejected them all. He frequently intercepted the scripts and burned them without ever showing them to his wife. He forbade her from speaking to other producers. If she dared to question his authority, his temper was explosive and terrifying. He would hurl objects, scream insults, and threaten to drive his car into a wall. Bergman, exhausted by the global hatred leveled against her and desperately trying to hold her fractured family together, submitted. She allowed the cage to close around her. She was forced to star exclusively in Rossellini's films. Together they made a series of highly esoteric, deeply personal movies: Europa 51, Journey to Italy, Fear. Today, modern film historians revere these films as masterpieces, the vanguard of modern cinema that laid the groundwork for the French New Wave. But in the early 1950s, they were colossal, embarrassing commercial failures. The public didn't want to see the former Hollywood saint wandering through desolate Italian landscapes, trapped in existential despair. The films lost staggering amounts of money, and as the films failed, the financial noose tightened. Rossellini, despite his artistic pretensions, had the extravagant spending habits of an aristocrat. He had a severe weakness for customized Ferrari sports cars, purchasing them on a whim even as their bank accounts drained. He bought yachts, racehorses, and purebred dogs. He lived like a Roman emperor, entirely funded by the Hollywood fortune Bergman had brought with her. Within a few short years, the millions she had earned in America were gone. The debts piled up. Creditors began to circle their home. Ingrid Bergman found herself sitting in the quiet, echoing rooms of her Italian villa, surrounded by unpaid bills, locked out of her own profession, and forbidden from holding her eldest daughter. She had traded a sterile managerial marriage in America for a volatile, financially ruinous dictatorship in Europe. She was entirely, desperately trapped. The world outside hated her. The man inside controlled her. The camera, which had once been her greatest ally, was now firmly in the hands of her warden. The Hollywood saint had been exiled, only to become the muse behind bars, suffocating slowly in the heavy golden light of Rome. The human spirit, when subjected to the crushing pressure of absolute isolation and public hatred, will usually do one of two things. It will either shatter completely into a million irrecoverable pieces, or it will harden into a diamond. For a time, the world genuinely believed that both Anna Magnani and Ingrid Bergman had been broken beyond repair by the relentless machinery of Roberto Rossellini's ego and the unforgiving moral judgment of the mid-20th century. Magnani had retreated into the sprawling ancient shadows of Rome, a bruised and discarded queen. Bergman remained locked in her Italian villa, drowning in a sea of her husband's exorbitant debts. Her career stalled in a series of avant-garde commercial failures, her heart bleeding for the daughter she was forbidden to hold. The patriarchy of the era had spoken. The film industry had turned its back. The moral crusaders had declared their victory. The narrative seemed closed. But history is rarely dictated by the men who shout the loudest from the Senate floor. It is written by those who refuse to surrender. Meanwhile, on the cobblestone streets of Rome, Anna Magnani was quietly forging her resurrection. She did not wallow in the bitter aftermath of the Volcano War. Her grief, her humiliation, and her rage were not weaknesses. They were an immense, untapped reservoir of power. And that power had caught the attention of one of the greatest playwrights of the 20th century, the American literary giant, Tennessee Williams. Williams was entirely captivated by Magnani. He did not see a discarded muse. He saw a primordial force of nature. He traveled to Rome specifically to meet her, and he was so mesmerized by her explosive authenticity, her dark, untamed hair, and her fierce melancholic eyes that he wrote a masterpiece entirely for her. He titled it The Rose Tattoo. It was the story of Serafina della Rose, a fiercely passionate, grief-stricken Italian-American widow living on the Gulf Coast, a woman who had shut herself away from the world, but was slowly, violently reawakening to life and to love. The character was, in every conceivable way, Anna Magnani. Williams desperately wanted her to debut the role on the Broadway stage, but Magnani, whose English was limited and whose fear of failure was masked by her fiery temper, refused. When the play was adapted into a major Hollywood film in 1955, Williams issued an ultimatum to the studio executives. Either Anna Magnani plays Serafina, or the film does not get made, and so the Roman she-wolf finally crossed the Atlantic. She did not arrive in Hollywood as a starry-eyed ingenue desperate for studio approval. She arrived as a sovereign power. She refused to conform to the polished artificial glamour of the American studio system. While other actresses spent hours in the makeup chair, having their features contoured and their eyebrows perfectly arched, Magnani sat before the camera with the dark circles under her eyes worn like badges of honor. She was raw, she was unkempt, and she was breathtakingly real. Her performance in The Rose Tattoo was an absolute seismic event. She poured every ounce of the betrayal she had suffered at the hands of Rossellini into the character of Serafina. It was a masterclass in feral, unfiltered human emotion. When the 28th Academy Awards were held in March 1956, the Hollywood establishment, the very same establishment that Rossellini had so desperately tried to conquer through his manipulation of Ingrid Bergman, bowed down to Anna Magnani. Magnani did not even attend the ceremony. She was asleep in her apartment in Rome, convinced she had no chance of winning. When an American journalist telephoned her in the middle of the night to tell her she had just won the Academy Award for Best Actress, she thought it was a cruel practical joke, but it was the undeniable truth. The irony was profound and absolute. Magnani had conquered the global pinnacle of cinema, not by riding on the coattails of an aristocratic Italian director, but by standing entirely on her own 2 feet. She had weaponized her heartbreak and turned it into gold. She had proved to Rossellini and to the world that she was nobody's stepping stone. She was the mountain. But while Magnani was claiming her crown, Ingrid Bergman was quietly plotting her escape from the gilded cage. The marriage between Bergman and Rossellini was suffocating under the immense weight of its own contradictions. Rossellini's desperate need to control his wife had isolated them both. He had burned through her Hollywood fortune, financing his extravagant lifestyle and his critically panned films. The walls of their Roman villa, once a romantic sanctuary, now felt like the cold stone of a penitentiary. But the paradox of a predator is that they inevitably grow bored of the prey they have successfully trapped. By the mid-1950s, Rossellini's eye began to wander. He grew restless with the domestic reality he had created. In 1957, under the guise of filming a sprawling documentary series, he traveled to India. There, displaying the exact same pattern of breathtaking selfishness he had shown to Anna Magnani 8 years prior, Rossellini engaged in a highly publicized affair with Sonali Dasgupta, a married Indian screenwriter. The ensuing scandal enraged the Indian government and dominated the international tabloids. Rossellini's grotesque hypocrisy was the key that finally unlocked Bergman's cell. He had demanded absolute fidelity and submission from her, yet he paraded his own infidelity on the global stage. Bergman did not weep. She did not beg him to return. The illusion was finally irreparably shattered. The spell was broken. She looked at the wreckage of her finances, the ruins of her reputation, and the empty space where her eldest daughter should have been. And she made a quiet, ironclad decision. She was going to take her life back. The opportunity arrived in the form of a script from 20th Century Fox. It was a massive, high-risk Hollywood production titled Anastasia. The film told the story of a destitute, forgotten woman wandering the streets of Paris, who is plucked from obscurity by a group of exiles and groomed to pose as the surviving Grand Duchess of the executed Russian royal family. It was a story about a woman entirely stripped of her identity, trying to remember who she really was, fighting to reclaim her rightful place in a world that had tried to erase her. No actress on earth understood that narrative better than Ingrid Bergman. Accepting the role was a monumental risk for both Bergman and the studio. The American public had not formally forgiven her. The venomous words of Senator Edwin C. Johnson still echoed in the cultural memory. 20th Century Fox was so terrified of a boycott that they did not film in America. They shot the movie in the studios of London and on the streets of Paris. Furthermore, the studio executives were nervous about how the American cast would treat the exiled saint. They cast Helen Hayes, the undisputed grand dame of American theater, to play the Dowager Empress, the grandmother who must decide if Anastasia is real or a fraud. The executives held their breath when Hayes and Bergman first met on set. If Hayes, a woman of impeccable moral standing, rejected Bergman, the film would collapse. Instead, when Helen Hayes walked onto the soundstage, she approached Ingrid Bergman, took both of her hands, and treated her with the utmost reverence and respect. It was a silent, powerful signal to the rest of the cast, and eventually to the world. Bergman was not a pariah. She was royalty returning from exile. When Anastasia was released in 1956, the sheer force of Bergman's talent obliterated the moral outrage. The public went into the darkened cinemas expecting to scrutinize a fallen woman, but instead, they found themselves weeping for a magnificent artist. Her performance was a tour de force of vulnerability, grace, and quiet defiance. She did not beg for the audience's forgiveness. She simply commanded their absolute respect. The tide of public opinion turned with staggering speed. Even Ed Sullivan, the television host who had sworn she would never appear on his show, engaged in a grotesque display of public backpedaling, holding a national poll asking his viewers if Bergman should be forgiven. The overwhelming majority voted yes. In March 1957, exactly 1 year after Anna Magnani's triumph, the Academy Awards were held in Los Angeles. Ingrid Bergman was nominated for Best Actress for Anastasia. She did not attend. She remained in Europe, sitting by a radio, shielding her heart against the possibility of rejection. When the envelope was opened, the room erupted. The winner was Ingrid Bergman. Her dear friend, the legendary actor Cary Grant, walked onto the stage to accept the golden statuette on her behalf. He looked out at the sea of faces. The very same industry that had blacklisted her, the executives who had canceled her contracts, the peers who had turned their backs. Grant smiled his charming, devastating smile, held the Oscar aloft, and said into the microphone, "Dear Ingrid, if you can hear me or see this, I want you to know we all send you our love and admiration." It was an apology from an entire nation. It was the ultimate vindication. In 1958, Bergman finally returned to the United States. When she stepped off the airplane in New York, the press was waiting for her. But there were no pitchforks. There were no picket signs declaring her an apostle of evil. There were only flashbulbs, cheers, and reporters clamoring to welcome her home. But the Oscars, the applause, and the redemption of her career were secondary. The true climax of her resurrection happened away from the cameras. Upon her return, she was finally agonizingly reunited with her daughter Pia. The girl who had been taken from her was now a young woman. There was lost time that could never be recovered, and wounds that would take decades to heal. The cruelty of the courts and the bitterness of Petter Lindstrom had left deep scars. But as they sat together, the silence of their forced separation was finally broken. The mother had survived the fire, and she had fought her way back to her child. In the years that followed, Bergman would go on to win a third Academy Award. She would cement her legacy as one of the greatest actors to ever step in front of a lens. She worked with Ingmar Bergman. She starred in classic after classic. She aged with an untouchable, majestic grace, refusing plastic surgery, allowing the world to see the lines of a life that had been fully, dangerously, and beautifully lived. And what became of the man who had tried to play God with their lives? Roberto Rossellini's cinematic influence as a pioneer of neorealism remains permanently etched in film history, but his personal shadow, the towering, terrifying ego that had tried to dominate these two extraordinary women, steadily faded into irrelevance. He spent his later years directing educational television documentaries. He watched from the sidelines as the women he had tried to pit against one another ascended into the realm of absolute myth. The Volcano War had finally drawn to a close, yet it was never truly just a battle between Anna Magnani and Ingrid Bergman. It was a brutal war between the indomitable female spirit and the suffocating cages built by patriarchal control and societal hypocrisy. Roberto Rossellini had viewed these women as empty vessels waiting to be filled with his genius, but a vessel cannot contain a volcano. They outgrew him and outlasted the moral panic. Senator Edwin C. Johnson became a forgotten footnote in the dusty archives of Congress, while Rossellini is remembered today as much for his cruelty as for his art. Bergman and Magnani remain eternal. They walk through the fires of public humiliation and institutional exile, paying a bloody price to claim ownership of their own bodies, art, and lives. They bled, wept, and were publicly crucified, but from the ashes of their destruction, they emerged victorious to reclaim their rightful places in the pantheon of cinema. They survived because, despite the immense weight of the machinery arrayed against them, they possessed the resilience and resources to fight back. They lost years of their lives, but at the very least, they were allowed to keep their own minds, retaining the memories of who they were, what they had suffered, and what they had ultimately achieved. But deep within the glamorous wings of the Hollywood studio system, back in the sun-drenched hills of California, there existed punishments far more barbaric than public exile.